Literature is the original internet. Every footnote, every citation, every allusion is essentially a hyperlink to another text, to another mind. Maria Popova.
You're listening to Writing Roots, brought to you by Aspen House Publishing.
Welcome to Writing Roots. I'm Lee Hull.
And I'm Lee Esses.
Most of today's episode is going to be for our nonfiction authors. There are things that you can learn and use when you're talking about fiction, but our topic of today is table contents, headers, footers, those things that you mostly see in the nonfiction education category.
Headers, we are going to be talking about how they're used in fiction, because those are pretty much across the board in a print version. But I've found most of my research into these things has applied more to the nonfiction or books that are fiction that are meant to appear nonfiction in some way.
So let's start off with the table of contents. You have a couple of different categories for this, because if you are formatting your book into an EPUB for something like Kindle, you will automatically have a linked table of contents to your chapters. And this is across the board, fiction, nonfiction, whatever. Because people like those little hyperlinks in their Kindles, their digital versions of the books, to be able to jump to where they want to go. In most formatting programs, if you use something like Vellum or Atticus, this is built into the system. You don't have to make it yourself.
This is also true of books that started off digital in some way. A lot of those web series and those kind of things, they will have a table of contents. Again, it's a navigation where, okay, last time I checked in on this blog, this character was doing this thing. So I think I was around this chapter, which has this chapter title, and therefore I can click on it and go, yes, I remember this, click on the next one. Okay, this is where I left off. Having that table of contents does make it helpful to re-engage after the writer's taken a break or not posted anything in their blog in a while.
You will also want a very well-organized table of contents if you will write a choose-your-own-adventure style story. Not only will you need those page references for when they're at the end of the chapter and you say, if you choose this, go here, if you choose this, go here, but having a table of contents will help you keep all of that organized for easily navigating the story, because you're not going to be reading it front to back in order.
And that really is the determining factor for when people care about the table of contents, is when they need to navigate the book because they're reading it out of order. This is very common for reference books. Things like, here's a medical journal and we're talking about how to set a broken bone over here, so that when you are opening the book, you are not reading it front to back. You are simply navigating to the part that you need to read right now and setting the rest aside for later.
Now let's talk about your footers. These are the little bits of information at the end of a page. So if you think about education writing, you'll have your little footnotes at the bottom of any references that you made on that page. You can do the same thing in fiction writing. There's one book that I read, I think Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia to Fairies, that beautifully used footnotes in the footers of her formatting to talk about other random things in the world. So she would reference an event, and because it was kind of written like an education research paper, but fantasy, she would have those footnotes and explain whatever this thing was, like this particular kingdom or this particular bit of mythology in the world or anything like that. So it's a very fun way to incorporate your world building into your Tolkien-esque or high fantasy story without having a lot of exposition in your book.
I would like to point out that it was an encyclopedia of fairies, so it is mimicking a reference book, and therefore you're playing with someone else's style. Even though you're telling this certain story in a fiction way, you're pretending it's nonfiction for the case of the formatting of the book.
So this is one of those cases you can use a very nonfiction style in your fiction book and have a lot of fun and be really creative with it. But overall, footers, especially references, citing sources, that is mostly going to be found in your nonfiction world. So if you're writing something like a Christian memoir and you're writing your story about how you found Christ, then you can use footers and footnotes to reference Bible verses.
Most of the time, you're going to see little asterisks or the little plus sign or some other tiny image. And then that image is on the bottom along with the information you're wanting to attach to it. This is often when they are citing either scientific studies or journals or scientists themselves. Having another reference, like according to this book of fairies, these things are how the world works.
Sometimes it will also contain self-references, internal references to the book itself. You can have the footnote offer like a really brief explanation. For more information, turn to page 26. When you're doing that, though, you really have to make sure that you put all those numbers in as you're doing the final formatting so that those page numbers don't switch around.
Yeah, and do it in order, because if you do it out of order, then the numbers will change as you add information. So in order is going to be your best bet for that. And then have a very enthusiastic proofreader. I was looking at the books I have in my collection and the ones that have content underneath the wall of text. And a couple of them actually put their page numbers on the bottom. One was a short story anthology, and they put all of those just centered on the bottom. And then the other was a Holly Black fantasy. So both of those had the page numbers on the bottom instead of the top, which we'll talk about in a moment. But this is another way to fill that bottom strip of space. So you just don't have it be words. If you're looking at the page going, this is an uncomfortable bottom, maybe moving the page numbers to the bottom might be helpful.
Yeah, I think I most commonly see page numbers, if they're not in the upper outer corners, they're in the bottom center on fiction. Nonfiction tends to be bottom outer corner to put page numbers, so that as people are flipping through looking for whatever page, because they reference that table of contents and they're looking for something specific, that's where they're going to look first for where they're turning, in most cases of like a nonfiction, say like a cookbook sort of thing.
Yeah, the one educational nonfiction book I have within reach of me right now has the numbers definitely on the outside, but it has them on the top.
Oh, interesting.
But you'll see it both places for sure. This particular one has book title on the top, and then chapter title on the opposite page on the top, and then page number on the outsides of the top.
So if you can't tell, where those are placed is largely up to personal preference, largely up to what you think fits the style of the book better. But let's get into those headers. This is where, in especially fiction, you will have important information about the book itself.
I've always assumed the information was on the top there as far as the author name and the book name for fiction a lot of the time. I always assumed it was like that for teachers who are copying off certain pages, so that it was like a copyright watermark stamp. That's when I first noticed that this was a thing. But it helps you recognize which book you're in and sometimes which portion of the book you're in, depending on how the book is formatted.
As we mentioned, generally you'll have the page numbers on the outer edge of the book. Every once in a while you'll have it in that bottom center. But you will also, in fiction, see a lot of the author's last name on the header and the book name on the opposite side. This tends to be author name on the left, book name on the right, but not always.
I think of the ones that I looked at, like 3/4 of my books had this format where it was outside page number, author name, and then on the opposing page, book name, outside page number again. There were a couple that did things a little bit differently. The short story anthology that had the page numbers on the bottom had the name of the anthology on the left-hand side and then the name of the short story on the right-hand side.
And I think that's a good way to do an anthology like that, because most anthologies don't have very recognizable authors in the name. And so that's not going to be as important as letting them know which story they're in within that anthology. That's a better delineator between chapters.
And I think nonfiction ends up being very similar, where you have the book name on one side, then the chapter or segment name on the other side. Just, again, to make sure you're navigating in the right spot, you go, oh, no, I'm in the cleric spells, I've gone too far. You can flip back.
This is one of those cases of look, explore, and find a style that works for you and that works for your books. There are different little flourishes that you can do, especially if you're looking at the page number, and then you'll usually have some sort of line or flourish or indicator between the page number and then your name or the book name. You can play around with it, make it yours, and have fun with it, and really let the personality of your book shine through in these small formatting opportunities. And it may not seem like a lot, but it can tell the reader a lot about the book. Take, for instance, the Harry Potter books. I remember them pretty iconically having a little star graphic in the corners and at the end of pages that became a fairly popular tattoo because it was so iconic to this book series in particular.
Yeah, anytime you can make your obviously fiction book feel like a nonfiction book, it's a lot of fun. It didn't work for me. I ended up rewriting the whole thing, but it was a great experiment for me and just a lot of fun to process and work through. How do I do this and that? And to give the reader information that they would not get in the normal way. So I encourage you to play with this and to learn how other genres do it so you can mimic them if you want to and have your own encyclopedia of fairies. And when you do, make sure that you
write selfishly.
If you have a question or comment for our hosts or a topic you'd like us to cover, send us an email at writingroots@aspenhousepublishing.com or find us on Facebook by searching for Aspen House Publishing.